When many Americans think of Iran today, they think of nukes, the hostage crisis, and flag burnings. In 1979, a theocratic Islamic regime took control in Iran after overthrowing their autocratic Shah, or king, Reza Shah Pahlavi. However, the Iran we see today was just one of the many paths the nation could have went on. In an alternate timeline, Iran could have been much different. Yet this depends on just which events would have been changed. Before we talk about how things could have been different, we need to explore the recent history of Iran. Two major revolutions in the 20th century changed Iran drastically. The 1953 coup, which was backed by the US and UK against the democratic Iranian government. This resulted in the Western-friendly Shah taking full control of his country, making Iran an autocratic, however modernized state. The second was the Islamic Revolution of 1979. After decades of rule, there was a growing disconnect between the population and the Shah. His government cracked down on political opponents. Eventually, religious conservatives and some social liberals had enough, and the Shah was ousted, bringing in a religious cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, who ruled the nation as an anti-Western Islamic theocracy. For the next 3 decades, Iran would be a rogue state, its people bitter from the 1953 US coup which brought in a dictator. The nation would fight in a brutal 7-year war against Saddam Hussein, which resulted in a stalemate. As the Ayatollah died, Iran slowly began modernizing again. However, social liberties are still extremely oppressive. Since this history is so complicated, this video will be split into 2 scenarios. 1. What if the 1953 coup never happened? And 2. What if the Islamic Revolution never happened? Okay, got it? Here we go. What if the 1953 coup never happened? Well, what exactly caused the coup? Before 1953, Iran was a constitutional monarchy. The Shah was still the head of state, however the parliament controlled the government. The main player in Iran's government was Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh. Mosaddegh wished for a secular, democratic Iran, one which was in control of themselves. How would they control themselves? Oil. Who controlled the oil? The British, because empire. The UK, under the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, had control of Iran's oil supply. The profits mostly went to Britain, while Iran was left with very little. Mosaddegh saw this as unfair, and believed the oil inside Iran to be rightfully Iranian, so he championed nationalizing the country's oil. Foreign workers were expelled, Iran began to get the profits from their own resources, and Britain was not happy. At all. At first, Britain ran to the US, wishing to overthrow Mossaddegh's government and get back that oil. America, however, cared very little about Britain's imperial problems and said no. Secretly even, the US empathized with Iran. This all changed when Eisenhower came into office. The UK was able to convince Eisenhower that Mossaddegh sympathized with communists. Mossaddegh actually didn't sympathize with communists, they sympathized with him. But under the fear of the Cold War, America was brought into anti-commie mode. Thus, the US and UK funded a coup which toppled the democratic government, Mossaddegh, and all the plans of nationalized oil. The extremely Western-friendly Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi, was brought into full power. Iran transformed into an autocratic monarchy. The Shah allowed the UK and US back in. In a twist of irony, America, fearing communism, swung its big ol' freedom stick and hit the innocent young Persian democracy. Now, what if this coup never happened? What would change? Well, here's an alternate timeline. The UK needed American help in overthrowing the Iranian government. In this alternate timeline, Eisenhower simply says no. The US convinces Britain to double their production elsewhere to make up for losses. By doing this, the Mossaddegh democratic government is able to control themselves. This profit significantly boosts the Iranian economy and the wealth of the people. Mossaddegh believed that the oil wealth should go to helping average citizens, and so projects are used to benefit the population. By doing this, he cements himself as a hero for Iran. It's hard to predict how the future of this government would be, yet one thing is for certain. With the oil revenue, this alternate Iran is able to boost their own economy and general welfare. This Iran has sour relations with Britain for a few decades, but eventually they mend ties. If Iran stayed on the path of this Mossaddegh democracy, it would be a secular power in the Middle East today. Now moving on to the second independent scenario, what if the Islamic Revolution never happened? Well, what exactly caused the Islamic Revolution? The Shah, who had been in absolute power for over 20 years, had grown very unpopular with most Iranians. This was because of two things: his rapid progressive movements, as well as his brutal crackdown on political opponents, using his secret police to silence any critics. The Shah wished to rapidly improve Iran, heavily influenced by secular European ideals. He wanted to use his rule to create a modern, westernized nation, even telling his neighbor, the conservative Saudis, to let their women wear miniskirts and have discos. Part of this plan was his White Revolution, a combination of land reforms, privatization, and educational improvements. The land reforms weren't much of a success and disenfranchised farmers. Education reached many new people across the country. The Shah allowed foreign companies to invest in the economy, setting up new factories. However, the Shah also created a wealth gap. The royal family grew wealthy off of the oil reserves, while money rarely went to normal citizens. The White Revolution, though, also pushed for women's rights, and by doing this, created many enemies in the predominantly Muslim population, one of which was a cleric called Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini was an open critic of the Shah, seeing him as a puppet to the West, and despised his reforms. After insulting the Shah, Khomeini was put under house arrest, and eventually sent into exile. Over the years, the flames of revolution grew, as Islamists and secular opposition grew against the Shah. Protests erupted in 1978. The Shah wished to negotiate with the protesters and decided to lift restrictions on press and stop corruption. This calmed them until a massive terrorist attack caused by Islamists but blamed on the Shah reignited rebellion. Protests grew, got violent, more died, until eventually the economy came to fall apart. The Shah's health began to fail him, and Khomeini's influence grew. Eventually the Shah left, and Khomeini returned. After some infighting, the monarchy collapsed, and the 2,500-year-old Persian Age of Dynasties ended. Khomeini implemented his idea of an Islamic state and turned Iran into a theocracy. The government went from a secular, westernized but censoring regime to an Islamic anti-Western censoring regime. What if the Islamic Revolution never happened? The revolution was a reaction to the Shah's Western policies. Many in Iranian society believed the Shah was attacking Islam and their culture. So for the Shah to keep control, he would have to lessen the speed of modernization. Change could come, it would just be gradual. Khomeini would have had to have died before he became an influential leader. Even if this resentment grew against the Shah, Khomeini fanned the flames drastically. His involvement sped up revolution. In this alternate timeline, Khomeini dies, and any rebellion doesn't have such an important leader to spearhead it. If the Shah never fell, Iran would have continued on its modernizing path. International businesses and factories invest in the country, much like we do today in China. Optimistically, the wealth gap could improve, yet this is up to your own opinion. Reza Shah Pahlavi would die near the same time as in our timeline, allowing his son, Reza Pahlavi, to take his place as king. Iran would stay allies with the Americans, being friends in the coming decades. In our timeline, the revolution in Iran allowed Saddam to invade the country. In the end, it resulted in a stalemate which prompted Iraq to invade Kuwait. In this alternate timeline, the Persian Gulf War never occurs, because the Iran-Iraq War never occurs, because the Islamic Revolution never occurs. In the 21st century, Iran would be a key ally for both bases and troops in the War on Terror. In a 9/11-like event by Al-Qaeda, Iran would invade Afghanistan alongside the Western nations. In this alternate timeline, Iran has nuclear weapons. In our timeline, during the 1950s, Iran began a nuclear program alongside the US and Europe called Atoms for Peace. If the Islamic Revolution never happened, the Shah's government would be armed with nuclear weapons today. In this alternate timeline, Iran would be an industrial nation, modernized much like China and westernized much like Japan. It's difficult to predict if the government would be less corrupt and how Persian society would change in the 21st century. These are simply predictions and not 100% conclusions. It's just interesting to theorize. The revolutions in Iran drastically changed how the nation could have been. The result of an oil dispute brought the country down the path of bitterness and isolation. Had the 1953 revolution not taken place, there certainly never would have been an Islamic theocracy. It's strange to think that one of America's greatest adversaries today could have easily been one of their greatest friends. What do you think could have happened had the 1953 coup or Islamic Revolution never happened? Say in the comments. Like on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.